Good evening. My name is Giovanni, and welcome to Face to Face. Tonight, we delve into the world of science and faith. And to answer whether those two things are incompatible, we're joined tonight by Dr. Connor Wood, who helps to explain why science is not the full picture of our human reality and experience. Are you ready? Let's get into it. So Connor, thank you so much for coming on the program. I'm looking forward to our conversation, especially as it relates to this issue of science and faith and, people's questions or people of faith sort of wondering how they can integrate those two things and whether they are able to be integrated. But before we get to even that point, I'd love for you to share with the audience a little bit about you, maybe where you grew up and where you develop or how you ended up developing this interest in Christianity. From our conversation previously, I know that you didn't grow up a Christian, but I'd love for you to share kind of a little bit of that story with our audience.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me here, Giovanni. And you're right, I did not grow up as a Christian. I grew up more or less in the sort of New Age counterculture. Mm-hmm. So that involved, it's just sort of a lot of crystals, incense. My mom would dabble sometimes in Wicca and paganism and things like that. And at the same time, there was a lot of kind of like science interest in science, scientism even. Yeah. We were definitely we were a Star Trek family, so lots of science fiction, lots of imagining kind of where science could take us. And, that kind of left me in the long run, as I grew towards adulthood and into adulthood, I think it left me with some questions about some unresolved sort of contradictions. Like, for example, in the New Age kind of way of seeing the world, we're all connected, right? It's all energy, and you can affect the world maybe with your mind by, I don't know. Who knows? Right. There's a question mark there, by, I don't know, something. And then, through your wishes, you manifest reality somehow, or you concentrate on you visualize, visualize your future and somehow it manifests. So and then on the other hand, the sciencey sort of, the scientistic sort of influences that I was swimming in, growing up, were also pretty materialistic. I mean, kind of by definition, right? And so it was, there was, for example, I was as a teenager in the 90s. I don't know if you've ever read the book or heard of the book, Listening to Prozac.
I've heard of the title. I've never read it, but I have definitely, I'm aware of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was a popular science book right after Prozac had come out, or a few years after Prozac had come out, and it was sort of giving a pop science view of why Prozac works, and ultimately it was sort of just it was a way of reducing the story reduced human experience to brain chemicals, right? Like you are. Right. Your brain chemicals, and every chemical just hits the other one according to natural laws, and you go back to the beginning of time. There's no such thing as free will. You're just a biological machine. Yeah. Yeah. And everything you think is you is just chemicals. Yeah. So those two stories don't fit together. Yeah. Like either we're all just chemicals and there's no spirit, there's no greater meaning. Yeah. Or we're these spiritual beings that can manifest our realities, but those don't go together. And yet somehow you find these often mishmashed together in the same spaces. Right. And, kind of spaces that have descended from the 60s counterculture, right?
Right, and which is actually still very strong, because everything that you were talking about in terms of, sort of energy and manifesting and all of that, it's very much still with us, as is, right, people who believe that really science is sort of is the answer to everything. So you still have the sort of competing views, and you live in that world. And so how, as you were looking at sort of the science and then that New Age wave of sort of, manifesting. And if you think it, you can become it or create a reality through your thoughts. When did you start to think through? I mean, you've already mentioned it a little bit, and you were thinking about these two incompatible ideas of, science and we're just chemicals, and then, this belief system just created in your mind. When did you try to integrate the two, or what was your process as you were coming or thinking about these seemingly incompatible ideas?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it was pretty confused for a long time.
Yeah.
I think that my mom was an alcoholic also, and so there was just a lot of chaos, growing up, lots of moving. So not much stability. And I think that without a kind of stable foundation, there wasn't a lot of clarity about how to reason through things like that. It was just sort of emotions, So I think I knew that at some level that something was not right, that these at least these two big stories didn't fit together, but I wouldn't have been able to tell you how or why, So I kind of just, I think I went in the direction of what one psychologist, Eric Erikson, calls the negative identity, where you basically just rebel. You say like, there's no good roles for me. I'm just gonna take on, kind of I got into Nine Inch Nails and Marilyn Manson and all that kind of stuff. So that was how I dealt with it at first, and then I think by the grace of God, I got into college. I only applied to one college, and they liked my essay enough to give me a scholarship. So I said, okay, fine, I'll go. And then I transferred to University of Wisconsin, where I was suddenly surrounded by lots of other people who wanted to learn. And I was like, whoa, I didn't know this was a thing. It was not cool to not learn. You were supposed to be really outgoing and party. It's a party school, but like you also needed to do your work. And so there was suddenly my intellect was being stimulated, right, in this way that it never had before, quite to that level. It was great, and I think that's when I started really thinking. And so that's when I started reading like evolutionary psychology. What does it mean for our brains that we are these evolved biological beings? So it wasn't leading me towards Christianity, but at least I was starting to grapple with the questions in a more rigorous way. And I remember reading Evo Psych books and papers and thinking like, this is really compelling. It seems to explain a lot, and also it seems like it misses something. It seems like there's unanswered questions here too, right? So it was another level of contradiction. And that I think that experience, if I step back for a second, at the same time I'm growing up in this kind of like hippie milieu with my mom and my stepdad moving around the country. My dad was still in my life. He was a member of a Sufi group, a Sufi fellowship in Philadelphia. So I would spend part of this each summer in Philadelphia. I'd be out in little towns in Wyoming or whatever, and then I'd go to Philly and be surrounded by like Tamil and stuff.
Now, for those people that don't know Sufi, what exactly is, Sufi?
So Sufism is
Sufism.
The simplest way to put it is it's sort of like the mystical branch of Islam.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's an oversimplification, but the version that my dad followed was from South Asia. There was a Sri Lankan saint named Baba who came to Philly and founded this fellowship. And it attracted a lot of hippies.
Right.
So I was still around the hippie world, but this one was at least a hippie world where they were talking about God. And so my dad kind of got me thinking about God growing up. He taught me about prayer and that there is one God. And, so I think that strain combined, like running into my pretty scientistic education as an undergrad, left me thinking like, this also is not compatible. There seems to be something to what my dad has been saying, and these influences and other people who have told me about God, but there also seems to be a lot to this more scientific way of seeing what we are. So I need to study religion as science. That's what I decided, right? So I looked around. I traveled around for a couple of years. I lived in Korea. I lived in Germany. I was just kind of continuing that rootlessness that I'd grown up
Yeah,
with, I think,
yeah.
looking back on it now.
Yeah.
And, I a few years after college, I started to think I need to deal with this more seriously. So I started looking for programs in religion and science, and I found the Boston University School of Theology, where my advisor, Wesley Wildman, my future advisor, Wesley Wildman, did a PhD program,
Yeah.
directed a PhD program on religion and science, where you were expected to do lab placements. So you actually have to do science, you
Yeah.
have to learn how to do science, and you need to master things like the philosophy of science, the history of science. And because it was a religion program, theology.
Right.
It was exactly what I wanted.
Yeah.
So it was very rigorous. It was difficult, but I applied, I got in, moved to Boston. And a few years into that program, I was still very much, what would you call it? I mean, I was still basically a kind of hippie counterculture person. I wasn't going to be a Christian. Like that
Right.
wasn't, it was like, I'm interested in God, but like I also like having girlfriends, and I also, I like to party, and cool people. I like to hang out with cool people, and Christians are not cool people. No offense, So, but so I carried that on for a couple of years, and then I just started thinking, look, all right, I'm in a theology program. I'm hanging out with theology people. Why don't I just start going to churches and just start, collecting experience, like as a researcher,
Right.
as a researcher. I'm not becoming Christian. I'm just studying it,
Yeah.
So I started going to churches around Boston, the most liberal ones I could find, where my hippie self would feel
Right.
welcome. And I just kind of started to like it. I started to feel, I would notice things like I would come home after going to my super liberal church, and all of a sudden I'd be like, I would like to clean my apartment, like just order would start happening around me, little bits of order being added to what had been a pretty disordered life, I think, right? And I liked the liturgy. I liked the ways that people connected at church, and I also liked something intangible. There was something else. I'm kind of grasping for words because there was something else, and I think that something else was just Jesus, right?
Yeah.
It was Christ,
Yeah.
and so I kind of, you talk to people sometimes and they have these sudden conversions, right? Where they're just living a life of dissipation and just, self-destruction. And then one day they wake up and they let Jesus in their heart and everything. I am as far away from that as you can get. I mean, it took me like a decade of slow, one step at a time, thinking it through, going to church, So.
Yeah, and there are many other people who have that same experience where I remember, I think it was reading the biography of, oh my gosh, I can't remember his name, but he converted from Islam to Christianity. And it took him a long time of conversations with a friend whom he met in college. And they would have these deep, discussions about Christianity. And it was him, because he was a devout, follower of Islam. And it was just a slow kind of getting to know both the faith and the authenticity of Christianity and that belief system, and God kind of slowly working in his heart. But God needed to convince him up here, and so there was a lot of in the course of the relationship with his friend. And he actually died of cancer, and I can't remember his name. It's killing me. But it was, sort of looking at the documents, that the Bible is, is authentic, and it is the Word of God, and there are all these, it has the most sort of original source, documents for what we have now today that we call the Bible. But anyway, so there are other people, and probably many more whom we don't know, that it's just a slow, right? Not everybody has that kind of, instant conversion, and they all of a sudden find Jesus, or Jesus finds them, kind of thing. But yeah, so it's, I'm familiar with, with that story. But it also sounds like a really beautiful story, because as a scientist, and I think of you as a scientist as well, because you do a lot of research. God takes us on a particular trajectory in terms of like how we come to know him, right? And every person is different, right? You're different from the way that I encountered, or my encounter with Jesus, it looks different because we're different people. And so he speaks to us in different ways, and we come to get to know him in different ways. So I think that's a beautiful story that, even though it might not seem like, oh, this big conversion, it is beautiful in its own way, just because of the way that God is able to reach each one of us where we find ourselves in.
Right. It's like Jesus calling Mary by name outside of the tomb.
Yeah.
Like that's the moment she recognizes him. Right?
Exactly. But talk to us, and here I really want us to kind of bring the audience in a little bit, because, oftentimes Christians have a really hard time, as I said in the beginning, integrating or feeling that, science and faith are incompatible. And this is a lot of the research that you do. And so talk to the audience, how we as people of faith can integrate these two seemingly incompatible ideas.
Yeah. Well, that's really easy. No, I'm kidding. It's not easy. I think that's actually part of the point, is that people think it's hard because it is hard.
Yeah.
I've never really bought into the idea that, it's just an illusion that science and religion seem incompatible.
Yeah.
No, it actually, there are some ways in which it's tough to work through. One worldview that basically presents the world as just being matter in motion, right, according to physical laws.
Yeah.
And another which presents it as being a story, right, where you have a role in it, and it's not just a story about stuff smacking into other stuff, right, and creating suns or whatever, and suns and stars and galaxies and all that stuff, right? It's a story about people, persons, right? Yeah. The scientific view of the world is impersonal by design. So when you kind of go back through the history of science and look at how what we now call science developed out of natural philosophy in the Middle Ages, I mean, some of the key steps are when thinkers like Galileo and John Locke and Francis Bacon said, okay, to do science, to do natural philosophy the way it ought to be, we have to get rid of what they called secondary qualities, which is just anything that seems to depend on human experience. So color. Color is a secondary quality, taste, things like that. We're only going to deal with primary qualities.
Right.
That's things that you can measure because they're objective, right? So that's like mass and density and length and width and stuff like that. Speed, velocity, whatever. Anything you can measure. That's primary. That's what's really real. And it turns out, that's super successful. It's a very successful strategy for trying to figure out how the world works as a physical system. Right. And B, it can't grapple with all of reality because clearly things like first-person experience, your subjective experience of the world exist.
Right.
So there's one scholar, a philosopher named Thomas Nagel, who argues that science has basically tried to create the view from nowhere. That's his phrase, right? And it's true. You're trying to figure out. It's almost like, imagine that there's like a little sculpture between you and me, right? And we can sort of see each other, but it's between us. And I can see this half of it, and you can see that half of it. But neither one of us sees the whole thing. So if we want to build a model in our minds of what the whole thing is, we have to share our perspectives and step away from those perspectives. And basically say, I have to say, like, my perspective's incomplete, so I need to distance myself from it. Yeah. And that's how science looks at reality, right? Yeah. So you're trying to get that view from nowhere. See what the sculpture would look like from nowhere. Yeah. But like, that's not actually how reality works. Yeah. Reality is not nowhere. Reality is a collection of, billions and billions of somewheres. Yeah. Right? People and probably animals, right? Looking out through eyes and seeing this reality. So, so you have to. That's kind of I realized that I said the first back there, but I didn't come up with a second. But I think maybe I did. But the second is basically like it's incomplete.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's an incomplete view of reality, and you have to be kind of firm about that. I think. Maybe one thing that's that people kind of sense but don't always articulate is that science can be addictive. Breaking the world down into parts and figuring out how they work together it's gratifying, but it can be gratifying in the same way that smoking can be gratifying, or something that just kind of fills you up but doesn't leave you feeling full, right? Because you're gonna need the next one,
Right.
And if as you ascend in the ranks of science and you get to the people who are really, really top notch and leaders, these are people that I really respect, but a lot of them have this issue, right? Where it's Darwin, for example, in his autobiography, complained that he had completely lost the taste for poetry.
Yeah.
He couldn't enjoy poetry anymore because he had turned his brain into a machine for grinding theory out of a series of facts.
Right.
And you just keep feeling like you need to do that. You solve one problem, so you go on to the next one.
Right.
So that's a cue. If you take a Christian perspective, anything that kind of reduces your freedom, right, that turns you into a machine, is not completely pointed at the truth.
Yeah.
There's something wrong with it at the base.
Right.
I'm not saying that's what all science is like, but I'm saying that when you get into that addictive mindset, right, which is,
right.
then you start to think like, well, you should be starting to think like something's wrong here. So the satisfaction that comes from breaking the world down into bits and turning them into theories and testing them and finding things out, it makes sense because your brain is kind of it's there to help you solve problems. It's there to grapple with the world, right? And so before there were ever any scientists, there were regular people out there, trying to figure out how to work. The door's coming off your hinge, and you're like a 2nd century Roman or whatever. There's no such thing as science yet. You're still going to be like, okay, well, where is it? There is the problem. No, the problem's there. You're going to test this.
Right.
But that's how you deal with the world.
Right.
Science just takes that capacity and ratchets it up to maximum and turns it into a worldwide collaborative institution that's very structured and regularized. So there are rules and expectations about methods, right, for how to do it, and share your results, that sort of thing. But it's still the same basic process of just trial and error against the world, right?
Right.
And I think that as you make science more and more this large institution, right, that has the benefit of so much collaboration, you just get more opportunities for that little hit of dopamine to be like, oh, I figured it out. I figured this out. Now I figured this out, right? I've had that experience. I'll be looking for an answer to a research question, and I'm scrolling through the literature, and I find a citation trail, and I just keep following that citation trail, and it becomes its own issue. It becomes its own thing. So.
Yeah. And I think anybody who's in research has had sort of similar experience. We end up falling in love with the process itself, which is, I think, what you're talking about. You become addicted to that. Oh my God, I need to, finding out more and more and more and more. But so what is the the antithesis of this world, which it's just observable and measurable and has methods, and it's not about color, it's only about what you can measure, and the height and width and whatever. The world of faith is,
well, let me put it like this. I like to think that the world of faith ought to be dealing with reality. And reality is the antithesis of that view from nowhere. Because the view from nowhere, the picture that it shows does not actually exist. I don't mean that atoms don't exist.
Right.
I don't mean that evolution hasn't happened. What I mean is that abstracted view, where the whole world is just quantities banging into other quantities, is not real. It's a model. It's a useful model.
Right.
As persons, I mean, I think one of the things that the Christian faith really has to offer the world is the tradition that's called personalism, right? We have a version of it here in Boston called Boston personalism. It's more of a Protestant version, and there's a strong Catholic version also that really influenced the recent late Pope Saint John Paul II, which basically says, look, persons are the core reality, and I think that's actually true.
Yeah.
You know, that because you can't have not only can you not have color without persons,
Yeah.
you also can't have length, width,
Right.
anything. Those all depend on a person having experience. You know, if you
Yeah.
want to measure a wall, somebody's got to hold the tape measure,
Yeah.
right? So everything comes back to persons.
Yeah.
And that's what the Christian story posits about the world, that God is a person, is a community of persons, in fact. God is personal. God calls the world into being in a personal way. It's not this, you know, a lot of world traditions see the creation of the world either in sort of impersonal terms, like it's something that sort of like happens,
Yeah.
or as in terms of the sort of arbitrary actions by powerful beings, right? The Christian tradition has the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, right? God creates the world out of nothing,
Yeah.
just because he wants to. Basically, just out of love.
Yeah.
Because love always has to have an object,
Yeah.
right? So God, by his very nature, must give rise to reality
Yeah.
that's got its ground in him, but is different from him. So right, so that there can be love there, and we're the product of that love. You know, and I think that that's a perspective that gives you a firmer, not just like a firmer grounding, but I think a much more accurate
Yeah.
view, because something else I've seen many times, and in myself, I think, and others, is that when you follow the scientific picture, the view from nowhere too far, it starts to cripple you emotionally. It makes it hard for you to relate to others. It makes it seem to you that nothing matters, because in that world nothing does matter.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
you have to have you have to have some sort of a personal perspective for anything to matter more than anything else. And if you from nowhere, it doesn't matter whether the sun explodes, and, you know, because there's nobody to care. So if you internalize, you know, I guess one way of summarizing what I'm saying is that you have to be careful what story you live in, what story you allow to inhabit you and shape your world. And if you let yourself get permeated by the scientific story of the view from nowhere, eventually you're going to find yourself looking at other humans like objects, you know, whether you want to or not, because that's what they are. They're complicated,
Right.
you know, complicated biological robots. And if you can learn the right ways to manipulate them, they can be input-output systems, just like a car.
Right.
Press the button, this comes out, you know?
Right.
And that really does happen.
Yeah.
Not to everybody, but there's a kind of damaging of the soul that can happen if you take that view to its logical conclusion.
Right.
Right? So I would say that to reconcile, to go back to your original question, to reconcile science and religion, I think ultimately you have to acknowledge that, or you have to take seriously that the view that science presents is useful but incomplete. You have to have no hierarchy can have two things at the top. You know, like a house divided itself can't stand. So you can't, if you're trying to have science and faith sort of equally integrated, it's like trying to put two ends of the same poles of a magnet together. Eventually, you have to decide which one you think is determinative. Is the top of, you know. And I think that the personalist story about us being personal beings in a personal cosmos is is the one that comes on top.
Yeah.
And where that conflicts with science, you actually have to say, well, science is incomplete there. And that will make some people quite upset.
Yeah.
You know, but you have to put your flag somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I just had some things going through my mind as you were speaking. So, you know, in terms of these two worldviews, what you're suggesting is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going to make sure that I'm capturing your words correctly. Is that faith, or where faith lies, is because we are both personal beings. We look at reality subjectively, or part of it is, right, that we're looking at reality subjectively. We see color, and maybe there are emotions, there are a host of things that make us human that science doesn't necessarily account for. Those things that belief systems and other ideas that we may have, or I don't know if I'm explaining it correctly or if I'm getting close to what you're suggesting in terms of the personal piece of faith.
Yeah, I think that it's not quite right to say that the subjective is true and the objective is just a model. The subjective is also often false.
Okay.
Right? Because you can be wrong about
Yeah.
your feelings can be wrong, and they often are. You know, if you feel really angry at somebody because they cut you off in traffic or whatever, but you don't know what's going on with them, right? You don't know if it was intentional, right? So, or whatever. Countless examples. So there was a well-known British physicist and theologian named John Polkinghorne, who had this idea of reality being like a stereoscopic vision. So we have stereoscopic vision, we have two eyes, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, if you're looking far away, it kind of doesn't matter. But if you look at something up close, you can see if you're looking through your different eyes that things are in a different, different place. So you use that that triangulation to get a more complete view of reality. And I think that's actually what's called for, is that there's the subjective point of view, which is undeniable, but often erroneous, right? And then there's the objective point of view, which is completely unreal, but often accurate.
Yeah.
Strangely, right? So what you need to do is to be able to use those different perspectives in a kind of dance to get a triangulated view of what reality actually reality actually is, because reality exists at the intersection of those.
Okay.
You know, you can't have reality without objects, but you also can't have reality without subjects.
Right.
It's almost as if reality has a Trinitarian shape. Right?
Right.
That you have to have me and you together that give rise to a reality, you know.
Right.
And
so it's about creating that complete picture that you're talking about. That our world isn't just those observable and measurable things, but it is also this other way that we're viewing the world, or the way that we view reality that isn't necessarily measurable. Yeah,
I might even say you could even say it's not tangible. Right? I mean, if you think about like, I don't want to get too deep into like brain rabbit holes, but there's a pretty well appreciated theory of how the brain works, right? That's called predictive processing. The brain is sort of like works just like I don't want to say machine, but what it does is it's always predicting what's going to come next. And that accounts for how vision works, but it also accounts for how really high level ideas work.
Yeah.
Right? And one version of this theory kind of breaks that up into two parts. One of them is if your brain has a false model about the world,
Yeah.
I thought my cup was here, but it's actually there. Sorry. Then I just update my model. I say,
Yeah.
okay, so reality has
Yeah.
told me that I'm wrong, so let me fix that.
Yeah.
But the other one is to say, I want something to be true. My model is not about what is actually
Yeah.
true. My model is about what's gonna be true.
Yeah.
And so then that's how we control our hands and fingers and things. We basically produce a model that says, in 2 seconds, my coffee cup is going to be up to my mouth. So the whole point is to shorten the gap
Yeah.
between your brain's predictions
Yeah.
and reality.
Right.
So if it's wrong about something, you can move the prediction, you can
Yeah.
change the model.
Right.
I was wrong, let me update my hypothesis. Or you can move reality.
Yeah.
You can say, I want that cup over
Yeah.
here, right? Well, a lot of the things that science, I mean, this is a scientific theory, right? So when you said earlier that science can't capture some of these things, I wanted to say that's not quite true. I mean, we have very robust theories of color,
Right.
You know,
That's
how,
true.
of like
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
the spectrum works, you know, and also how vision works, right? So it accounts for them. It just never gets to the point where it accounts for how it becomes a first-person experience.
Yeah.
That's what they call the hard problem
Yeah.
of consciousness.
Yeah.
I don't think it's solvable myself
Yeah.
because I think that first-person points of view have been excluded from science from the foundation since the 1600s.
Yeah.
But what I was going to say about this sort of the brain doing these predictions and sometimes needing to change the world to map
Right.
the predictions. Well, that's how we do things. That's how any organism lives. You can't just update your predictions. Sometimes you have to go out and change the world,
Yeah.
right? You have to get your food or whatever. That's also how we as people create things like cities,
Yeah.
governments,
Yeah.
religions, right?
Right.
You say like, is it true? Is it an objective fact that Boston exists? Like, no, actually. If you take the view from nowhere, it's just a bunch of rocks and and materials.
Yeah.
Like, show me objectively where the boundary between Boston and Cambridge is in the middle of the Charles River. It's not there. It's it's like an agreement. And then to make that agreement work, we all have to do that thing where we adjust our ideas. We say, okay, well, I've got this property here, and so that means I have to pay taxes to Cambridge, right?
Right.
So there's this way. So I don't want to get too far afield, but there's this way in which, if you take the view from nowhere, and you're just trying to look at what's actually true right now,
Yeah.
you can't get to things like goals, right? And if you can't have goals, then you can't have shared goals.
Right.
And if you can't have shared goals, then you can't have cities, you can't have governments, you can't have presidents and kings and all the other stuff that makes the world work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Our world.
Yeah.
Right.
Sort of the creating reality, as you're calling it right now.
Yeah.
Which science doesn't account for in many ways.
No, in a lot of ways, science. I mean, speaking of faith, I mean that like faith is not just for religion, right?
Yeah.
Like you have to have faith that Boston exists. If everybody stopped believing it exists, it would stop existing because we'd stop paying attention to it, right?
Yeah.
So there's this whole level of things that we co-create that require faith to like pop into being, and that is, I think, well suited to I think that dovetails with the Christian doctrine of us being the imago Dei, right? That we are the image of God.
Yeah.
And I always say, like, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that God looks like a big old man in the sky? Like, no. What it means is that we bear that image of being able, right, to co-create just like he does, right? He creates the world, and Christ, the Logos, moves to create the world, right? And the Holy Spirit is the kind of what holds it together, right? Well, in the same way, I can say like, oh, you know, this thing, this, you know, I dub thee night, right? Or whatever thing you want to do, and you're creating a new thing in the world.
Yeah.
It's just this little tiny participation in how God creates.
Yeah.
But it's really important.
Yeah.
And this is where, if you don't mind, I think it's actually kind of interesting that science, in my view, points back toward Christian views of human nature. Because over the past maybe 3 decades or so, a lot of very smart people have been studying human nature in new ways, right? Kind of even the scientific study of religion, like why do we have rituals?
Yeah.
You know, somebody's got to ask. So eventually, a scientist had to ask, like, how come human sacrifice keeps happening?
Yeah.
Like that does happen all over the world
Right.
throughout the historical record. What the heck, you know? Why do we do things like believe in beings that nobody sees?
Yeah.
So they started taking that seriously and researching that in a scientific way. Most of them did not become Christians, right? I'm an exception, but the view of what human nature is that kind of comes out of that research is basically that we are language using animals that are able to share attention and so create new levels of reality together.
Yeah.
And as you know, other animals can be very smart. Chimpanzees have actually better working memory than we do. They can hold more objects in their minds at once, but they can't create, you know, Westminster Abbey or Boston because they can't share attention in that way, and they can't use language to conjure up pictures in each other's minds. You know, where if I say, like, think of Westminster Abbey, you know, you're thinking of it, but not only are you thinking of it, I know that you're thinking about it, and you know that I'm thinking about it. So we're sharing that attention. It's a fantastic skill, and it's one that seems to be almost completely unique to humans.
Yeah. And so this idea of, you know, science and faith, you know, science provides only a piece or a portion of the full story. And we, as being created in the image of God, we're able to actually create reality, whereas science can just measure and, you know, length, width, things that we've created. And yet science does not take into consideration that we human beings are creating reality. If I think I got it right, maybe.
I think that's exactly it. Yeah, and I think it's not, you know, it's not coincidence that the modern era, the last 500 years or so, has been marked by lots of skepticism. Not just about God, but about things like government. The reality of things that humans do. You know, I mean, obviously governments rise and fall throughout history. It's not like this is new, but I guess what I'm saying is that you're exactly right. There is something about science that works as an acid, dissolving everything that humans create. Because if you agree to say, I'm only going to believe in stuff that I can objectively verify. Well, not only there goes God, but there goes Boston. There goes marriage. There goes kings, presidents, school boards, everything that you need to co-create together, right? So there's a way in which science is, it's incomplete. It's very handy. Like it gives us real insights into real reality. That's super important, you know? Quantum physics works to an absurd degree, right? There's something really there. But if you take that as your story, that's the lens you see the whole of reality, you can't have things that that make humans unique. You end up pushing, it's almost as if being too scientifically minded literally pushes you back towards being a chimpanzee. Because chimpanzees are like us. They're like, their hands are really similar, you know, but they don't have that. They don't have cities. They don't have those things. So.
And one of the things that's really interesting, and I think I'll end here. I was reading a book, and I don't know if you read these types of books, but it's Super Communicators by Charles Duhigg, who wrote the book on habits. And one of the interesting things that he says at the end, he cites a study, and I think it's become famous. It's the Harvard longitudinal study about happiness, et cetera. And, you know, it's this idea, right, that at the end of it all, what is it that makes people happier or flourish or feel fulfilled in their life. And it is relationships. It's the other people in their life, right? And so as you're talking about science and sort of that it reduces everything to what can be measured or even us into like atoms or chemicals in our brain, it ignores completely that reality that we're human, right? And that as human beings, we need one another both to co-create, but also just in general in how the Trinity itself, right, is able to have this beautiful relationship, right? Because it comes down to relationships. And so I think as a beginning of our quest to integrate science and faith, this is going to be a series. This is a perfect first basis on how we see sort of how the two, science and faith, can be. There's a third way, right, of looking at both, but that the personal, the creative, sort of intangible is still, it has supremacy over the scientific. Even though there is value in that, in what we are able to get from the scientific method, but that at the end of it, right, it's how we've been created in the image of God that really integrates all of those things.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Connor, for joining us.
Thank you.
It has been a wonderful conversation. I have learned a lot today. You have expanded my mind in a very good way.
It's been a lot of fun.
And I hope that your mind as well has been expanded, as well as your faith expanded by this conversation. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.